there is a Chinese saying called 无心插柳柳成荫. Literally means you want to plant and it's not growing. You occasionally throw something, whatever, wherever, and grow into a very good, park, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, this begs a million questions, okay? Because one is, there is an information order that exists there, It's fascinating how the, Facebook, for instance, dominates the world transmission of knowledge. Now, I understand that, China is slightly different because, the Great Wall of Mandarin has created its own apps and its own social ecology of media. Yeah. And so people don't use the Facebook and Meta products as much, although they do use it a little, but not as much. But in the rest of the world, these things are quite influential and important. But it's not just that, it's the hardware. I live in Santiago in Chile. For me to talk to you, information has to go from my house in Santiago down a cable that goes to Los Angeles, and then the cable that goes across the Pacific. The cable that goes from Santiago to Los Angeles is owned by a private company. Now, they could easily say that, either these 10 accounts or any metadata, you use these words, will slow it down. They don't need to ban. What is shadow banning? Shadow banning isn't a ban. It just means that things are slowed down for you. So that if you and I are doing an interview and I'm in Santiago, my internet is slowed down. So it becomes difficult for us to do this properly. So we just have to say, well, you'll have to say, look, I'm no longer going to talk to you. There are many different ways in hardware. And then software is important. Even people I know, they feel like, well, okay, I like reading you, but in the morning when I wake up, I go to BBC to check the news. I don't go to you to check the news. I go to BBC to check the news. Or I go to CNN or, something or the other. This is fascinating. The colonial grip on our brains, how many people wake up in the morning and they say, I'm going to go to CGTN to see what the news of the day is, or RT, I think if you're reading in Russian, you may go to Russian news channels. If you're reading in Chinese, you'll go to Chinese news channels. But, those who read in other languages, or whose default language is one of the European languages, end up going to these so-called mainstream, and even if they don't, and here comes the worst part, a reporter in China will, to find out what's going on in, say, Romania, because there's an election.
They'll go to Western media to find out.
We'll go to Reuters. We'll read the Reuters wire, we'll read the Agence France Presse wire, we'll read the Associated Press wire in order to write their story. Because they don't have contacts and sources. So even their stories in Chinese, in Russian, in Hindi, totally defined by the Western media. So we have an uphill task, and I must say that, even when big countries like China and Russia are the two that have actually, and Qatar are the three countries that have tried to build international media. Al Jazeera, CGTN, and RT. These are three countries that have tried to build. Even they haven't really been able to build very good footprints around the world. So Al Jazeera is largely Arab reporting. The rest of their reporting, they have one guy in Africa, somebody, it's nothing. Chinese media is similar. There's just not enough of a footprint. Chinese media reports the US better than it reports South America. Xi Jinping was in Peru to open a port. I don't know how much news coverage there was of that. $3.6 billion port, 18 berth, very important development. But the news stories I saw didn't talk about the fact that just a few years ago, the attempt to build a port in El Salvador was stopped. Why weren't these things brought together? because journalists don't have a longitudinal history of following these things in our countries. And this gives us a problem because then you just absorb the stories from the Associated Press. So when are we going to get confident not to be like second order reporters, but to make, to be the references?
Is that a part of the reason why, a lot been talked about at the conference yesterday, that the mood in the global south is shifting, like people are sort of united in what they are against, but effectively what is the new world order, what are the new narratives going to look like? It's very difficult to build solidarity around that. Is that part of the reason why?
I mean, part of it is that we just don't yet have the full confidence. Just to be very blunt with you.
Yeah, one of the key takeaway from the conference yesterday is like, what if you don't have the capacity to build a capacity? Right?
Exactly. Right? I mean, you have a channel. That's two channels. Yeah. How many people outside China will spend time watching what you're saying? You have to have an ambition to have millions of people outside China watch what I don't make media for India. I want viewers and readers from Romania, from Azerbaijan. We built a syndication service called Globetrotter, which I work for. I'm the chief correspondent. What we do in Globetrotter is, Shaoli, you will write for me an article, 1,000 words, on something that you've seen.
I remember you told me about that. Yeah.
And we syndicate it for free. And 400 publications around the world can use it. And they do. They do it in Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia. They print it. Asia Times in Bangkok, La Jornada, one of the major papers in Mexico, prints our material in there. And it's free. It's basically like somewhere between an op-ed, an editorial, and a report.
Basically, you source from reporters or editors from around the world who can reflect the sentiment on the ground.
Yes.
Right?
So you have to learn to write about China for an audience in Mexico, in other places, and so on. So, but it's not like you're not writing for a 3-year-old. You don't have to explain everything. But the point is, we're trying to compete with a different form of journalism with the wires. And obviously, we don't have the capacity. Like, we can't release 10 stories a day. We release 3 or 4 a week maximum. Yeah. But I want to get to the point where we release 10, 12, 15 stories a day. Like, what's the biggest story today in China? Why haven't you written the 1,000-word piece? Okay, right now it's written, it's print, web and print journal. But eventually, why can't we think about doing some sort of video content where you report? And now you say, well, what about languages? There's a lot of AI tools that we can use, to try to dub.
Could you source more from our website and our video channels?
Well, we don't do video yet.
Oh, okay.
But
we have articles on our website.
Let's take it.
Yeah.
Let's do it. We started a journal a few years ago where we made a partnership with Wenhua Zhongheng, with editor Yan Ping, and said, okay, you have a journal in China. Well, I think that Chinese intellectuals of a certain sort are not listened to outside China. In other words, Western, think tanks and so on have relationships with Chinese intellectuals. It's not like no Chinese intellectual is read outside. But these are typically Western-oriented intellectuals that will be published by the Brookings Institute and by the Council for Foreign Relations in the US and by, some foundation in Europe and so on. These are Western-oriented intellectuals, and China is filled with Western-oriented intellectuals. Well, it's just a factual.
Don't we know that?
Yeah, it's a factual statement. Yeah, no judgment.
And so many in the Chinese government too. The bureaucracy.
Well, you know better than I on that. No comment.
Agree with me.
No comment. Certainly in the academy, it's there because I read them. In these mainstream books and so on. But there are a whole other bunch of intellectuals who are interested in developing different lines. They don't have to be anti-US or anti-anybody. There are people who are interested in what's going on in Africa. What's China's role in Africa? What does it mean to build an ecological China and so on. So with Wenhua, we said, look, you have a nice magazine, but we want to make an English, Spanish, Portuguese edition. an international edition, because we would like Chinese intellectuals' views to be out there. So we made it. We're on the second year of this project. I feel the same about journalism. Like, where are the commentators, the people who we train, together to be serious reflectors? Okay, there's a some speech given by a political leader or important meeting that could be reported, but more interesting to me is that there's a village in China where there's a football league. That's an interesting story,
that's an interesting story.
Why is that interesting? It's captivating. It tells you about rural revitalization, abolition of poverty. It tells you about how women dominate in the rural areas. You can beg the question, if there's so many women leaders at the rural areas, why aren't they in Beijing? And so on. It's great stories. We need those, I'm very much opposed to the gap between so-called hard news and soft news. I think that's a bourgeois distinction. There is no such thing as hard news. Why is the voice of a woman leader from a rural community telling you about how she's trying to improve the capacity or the potential of her people through using the internet for farming? How is that not as important as, let's say, a governor of a province talking about something? Why is her voice less important? It's as important. She's reflecting a reality. So I would love for Chinese journalists to be read, in other parts of the world. I would love more Indian voices in China. It's stunning how poor our mutual reporting is. In India, the coverage on China is appalling. It's all what is happening in small circle of the government. If that, people don't follow what's happening with much care. Similarly, in China, there are so few people. There's so few Indian journalists who are capable of writing for a Chinese audience, explaining the realities in India. And unless you have more people-to-people understanding, if the universities aren't doing it, journalists have to do it. Unless you have that, how do you expect countries to come closer?
How have you do you see the public perception about India here in China? Is it shifting? Is it better?
Well, it's not good because if you count on social platform, then there, as I said, is for ads, for revenue. Otherwise, the social platform isn't providing any currencies. So you have to sell goods. To sell goods, you have to attract people into your video by what? By surprise, by anger, by moods, basically, not by fact.
Sensation.
So I will give a very good example. The BBC got a fake news saying the boss CEO of Uniqlo, a clothing brand, he said, we're not using cotton from Xinjiang, which is totally fake news. The Japanese version, because the guy is Japanese, okay, Yanai Tadashi, he told the Japanese-speaking BBC reporter that we're now not using cotton. Not using could be a lot of reasons. They make very cheap t-shirts. Of course, they use synthetics. Yeah, they don't use the cotton. It could be a good reason. But the BBC English channel says the Uniqlo is not using Xinjiang cotton. They changed it to does not. So not using and does not is totally different. Why?
In Japanese, did he say Xinjiang cotton?
Yeah.
Because it was a question.
It was a question. Yeah.
Okay.
And after doing the Japanese version of interviewing, the Japanese-speaking BBC reporter actually faked another asking recording in English.
The questioning part.
Yeah, the questioning part was re-recorded.
Yeah.
Like faking, I'm asking.
Yeah.
This time she was telling English. But the original video, she was speaking Japanese with the CEO of Uniqlo, right?
Yeah.
So I made that video doing fact checking. I saw a lot of video got more viewing count than me. They're just critiquing on Japanese imperialism for no reason. And telling their audience wrong name of the CEO. The guy's called Yanai, right? His surname. The guy is saying, Yaina. The order of the name is wrong, but doesn't affect. He's telling the anger to their audience, getting more viewing
It's a
counts.
very
than me.
important point.
Yeah,
See?
you see, I mean, people like the Chinese social media or Chinese views are being criticized to be or being nationalistic. But I mean, here's the thing: that they're all. I mean, he is the opinion leader in China, and he is very rational about it. So the CEO of Uniqlo has always maintained that we're going to stay out of politics. The BBC lady really forced it, shoved it down his throat, and then in the way they put it out. Now, you know, technically they did not misinterpret it or misrepresent him, but the way they reported it was very misleading. And sure, the Chinese internet followed because, you know, you always follow the bad news, right? You know, somebody's against China, you know, they're boycotting Chinese Xinjiang while wanting to make money from here. And so they follow, and even with like sensible multi-million influencer like him, he put out very reasonable analysis of the whole thing, and it's very difficult to shift it. So
You see, Uniqlo should be sponsoring us right now.
They're not even.
They should be.
they
But-
should be. You should be.
Yeah, but your point is a really good point because it's interesting. You asked the question about India and he gave the example about Japan.
Yeah.
Because the point is what? The point is that our audiences also follow, you know, the kind of political atmosphere. And it is much easier to inflame people into
Yeah.
jingoism
Yeah.
than it is to inflame people to understanding. You know,
Triggering
much easier.
hatred
Yeah.
to sell goods.
Much easier.
It's much easier.
When
than
I write
reporting
in
facts.
Guancha, occasionally my friends will clip some of the comments
Yeah.
and translate and send it to me. And people write things like, you know, this curry smelling Indian makes sense, you know, and so on. And it is funny because in India you would get the similar reaction. There'd be some, you know, these mutual antipathies and sort of casual racisms, you know, that we have. These have to be overcome, but you know, who leads in the process of overcoming it? A lot of this is to the political leaders.